In 65 AD, a man sat alone in a room in Rome and waited to die. He had been ordered to end his own life by the emperor he once served. The guards were outside the door. The decision had already been made. His name was Seneca, and what he did next in those final hours was not what most people would do when facing death. He didn't beg, he didn't bargain, he didn't fill the room with words trying to undo what couldn't be undone. He went quiet. He called his friends to him. He spoke calmly, deliberately, and when there was nothing left that needed to be said, he stopped speaking altogether. He had written for decades about the recklessness of unnecessary words, about the power that lives in restraint, in withholding, in the choice to say nothing when everything inside you is screaming to speak. In his final hours, he lived what he had taught. And the question that has followed that moment through 20 centuries of philosophy and psychology is this: what did Seneca understand about silence that the rest of us are still struggling to learn? Think about the last time someone said something that hurt you. Not a small thing, something that landed. Now think about what you did next. Most people talk, they respond, they explain, defend, justify, argue. They fill the air with words trying to correct something that words made wrong in the first place. They fire back immediately, before the emotion has cleared, before the thought has formed, before they've had even 1 second to decide whether responding is actually in their interest. And here is what that impulse costs you every single time. The moment you respond from a place of reaction, you hand control of the exchange to the person who provoked it. You've shown them exactly where the wound is. You've confirmed that the words landed. You've made yourself legible, predictable to someone who was testing you to find exactly that. Psychologists who study social power dynamics call this emotional unmasking, the involuntary revelation of your internal state through your behavior. And it happens fastest when you speak before you've decided what you actually want to say. Silence disrupts that entirely. Not because silence is passive, but because silence is the one response that cannot be predicted, cannot be categorized, and cannot be used against you. It gives nothing away. Here is a finding that researchers have spent years trying to explain. In social interactions, silence does not feel neutral to the person who receives it. It feels powerful. Studies on interpersonal communication have found consistently that in a conversation between two people, the one who speaks less is perceived as more dominant, more confident, and more in control, even when there is no other evidence that this is true. Even when the silent person has done nothing at all, the perception itself is generated by the discomfort that silence creates in the person who is filling it. And that discomfort is revealing, because the person who cannot tolerate silence will always try to break it. They will talk, they will explain themselves, they will fill the gap with information, with their anxieties, their justifications, their need to be understood, all of it flowing into the space that the other person refused to occupy. In negotiation, this is so well understood that it is considered a foundational technique. You make your offer, you state your position, and then you stop talking. Because the first person to break the silence after a negotiation point has been made almost always concedes something, not because they were weak, because the silence became unbearable, and filling it felt like relief. The Stoics knew this 2,000 years before the research confirmed it. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, the man from whom Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus drew their entire philosophical lineage,
built silence into the structure of how he taught. He was famous for saying almost nothing in the presence of powerful people, not from shyness, from strategy, from the understanding that every word you produce is information about you, and that not every situation deserves your information. He had a saying that his students passed down for generations: "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in that proportion." But here is where it becomes more complicated, because silence is not always power. Sometimes silence is the opposite. Sometimes it is absence disguised as restraint. Sometimes the person who says nothing is not withholding from a position of strength. They are withholding from fear, from the terror of being wrong, from the anxiety of saying something real and having it rejected. And the difference between those 2 silences is almost invisible from the outside. They look identical. One person is quiet because they have decided not to speak. The other is quiet because they are unable to. Both say nothing, but inside they are completely different experiences. The psychologist who has perhaps studied this distinction most carefully described it this way: there is a silence that comes from fullness and a silence that comes from emptiness. The first is chosen, the second is imposed. And the person living in the second kind of silence often mistakes it for the first, tells themselves they are being strategic, being restrained, being deliberate, when what they are actually doing is hiding. This is the distinction that most people never examine in themselves.
Marcus Aurelius wrote his private journal, the book we now call Meditations, in a tent on the front lines of a war he didn't want to fight. He was emperor of Rome. He had every resource, every advisor, every voice in the empire available to him at any hour. And he wrote alone, at night, in silence. What he wrote in those pages was not correspondence with the world. It was a sustained private conversation with himself, a discipline of turning inward, away from the noise of the court, the demands of the campaign, the constant input of advisors and generals and flatterers, and finding in the quiet the only voice that actually mattered to him, his own. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But that sentence doesn't mean what most people take it to mean. It is not a motivational thought. It is not a reminder to think positively. It is a recognition, precise and slightly disturbing, that the world outside you will always be in motion, always be loud, always be demanding a response. And the only possible source of stability in that environment is the cultivation of an inner life so practiced, so disciplined, so consistently returned to that the noise eventually loses its grip. The silence Marcus Aurelius cultivated was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of self. And that is a completely different thing to build. Neuroscientists at Duke University conducted a study a few years ago that most people have never heard of. They were studying the effects of music on the brain, specifically how the brain responds to different types of auditory stimulation. As part of the experimental design, they included periods of silence between musical passages as a control condition, a neutral baseline. What they found surprised them. The silence wasn't neutral. During the silent intervals, the mice in the study showed significant neurological activity, specifically in the hippocampus, the region of the brain most closely associated with learning, memory, and the formation of new cells. 2 hours of daily silence produced measurable neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons. The silence wasn't doing nothing, it was doing something that stimulation couldn't. It was giving the brain the conditions it needed to consolidate, to integrate, to build. The researchers had set out to study music,
They ended up accidentally discovering that silence might be one of the most cognitively significant experiences a brain can have. And yet, we treat silence as a gap to be filled. Think about how you behave on your phone in the 30 seconds between one task and the next. Think about what you do in an elevator. Think about the last time you sat in a room without a screen, without music, without a podcast filling your ears, and let the quiet simply exist. Most people cannot do it for more than a few minutes, not because they don't want to, because silence in the absence of practice produces something deeply uncomfortable. It produces you, just you, without the input, without the stimulation, without the constant feed of information that keeps the self at a comfortable distance from itself. In real silence, the things you have been not thinking rise to the surface. The feelings you managed all day start to move. The questions you answered with distraction come back, unanswered, and sit there waiting. This is why most people avoid silence, not because it's empty, because it's full.
Seneca understood this before neuroscience had a language for it. He wrote in one of his letters that survived that the person who cannot stand to be alone with themselves has something to answer for, not as a moral judgment, as a psychological observation. The person who fills every quiet moment, who cannot tolerate the absence of external input, who reaches for stimulation the moment silence appears, that person, Seneca argued, is running from something. He called it the restless mind that cannot dwell in itself. And his prescription was not complicated. Stop, sit, let it come. Not to fix whatever rises, not to resolve it or process it or turn it into a lesson, just to let the mind settle into its own depth and see what's actually there. He wrote, "Nothing, to my way of thinking, is a better proof of a well-ordered mind than a man's ability to stop just where he is and pass some time in his own company." That sentence was written 2,000 years ago. It has never been more difficult to follow than it is right now. Here is the tension worth sitting with. We live in a world that rewards expression. Every platform you use is built around output, publishing, posting, reacting, sharing. The architecture of modern social life is designed to produce maximum verbal and emotional output from every person in it, to extract your reaction, your opinion, your response as rapidly and as constantly as possible. And that architecture is working. The average person today speaks more, produces more text, more audio, more reactive communication than any generation in human history, and listens less, and reflects almost not at all. What gets lost in that is not just quiet. What gets lost is the version of you that only appears when the noise stops. Because there is a version of you that doesn't perform, that doesn't manage an impression, that doesn't shape itself to what the room expects. That version is quieter than the one you show in public, slower, more honest. It notices things the performing self doesn't have time to notice. It knows things about you that you haven't admitted yet because you haven't been quiet long enough to hear them. That version of you lives in silence, and most people are on very unfamiliar terms with it. The most powerful people in any room are almost never the loudest. This is something that observers of human behavior have noted across cultures, across centuries, across every kind of social environment. The person whose presence is most